I don't recall much from my early years. I grew up in a quiet town just south of Krakow with my parents and two sisters. Those days are mostly a haze, though one memory stands out. Roaming the neighborhood during the Zinke Harvest Festival, knocking on doors and asking for sweets. It was a cherished routine for us, knowing the neighbors always stocked up on far too many treats. We'd collect the extras and hold our own little banquet. Each door opened with a playful grin, the neighbors affectionately scolding the mischievous bunch from the Dabrowski family. Of course, joyful times shine because darker ones follow, and suddenly you realize how much you had. My parents split up. Mom relocated to Warsaw so we could be nearer to our grandparents and uncles. My father, Jeremiah, tried to keep in touch, but the effort wore him down. He had to take on more work, clocking longer hours, though he never missed a month of sending money. He wanted to give us a good life, even if he couldn't share it with us. As time passed, the visits came less often. We stopped celebrating Easter together, then missed Christmas, followed by birthdays, and eventually even our traditional Zinke reunion. The last we heard, he was barely scraping by. The money stopped, and slowly he faded into the past. Mom remarried, and my sisters moved on. My eldest went off to Ljubljana, while the youngest settled in Munich. My mother remained in Warsaw with her new spouse, but once the kids moved out, she relocated to her northern vacation house. I adore my mom, but she's always been drawn to the finer things, always chasing the next getaway, the next sunny escape. I stayed behind in Warsaw, earned a degree in sociology, and landed a modest government position handling private claims. It wasn't exciting. Most of it was just absorbing complaints, defending choices, and repeating the process. When I turned 24, a letter from an estate attorney arrived. It turned out my father had died. Not recently either. According to the documents, he'd been gone for several years. A tragic mishap involving farm machinery, no official will, and the matter of dividing what he left behind hadn't been addressed in time. It had been buried in paperwork, forgotten, until now, when it resurfaced. The estate was split evenly between me and my sisters. The youngest received his savings, the eldest took his car and personal items, and I ended up with a house. I reached out to see if anyone wanted to visit his resting place, but no one was interested. They were all wrapped up in their own responsibilities and struggles. My family had convinced themselves that our father had walked out on us, and this silence was our way of turning our backs on him in return. But I saw things differently. To me, he hadn't left us. He just worked himself into distance. I decided to take a break from work to sort through his belongings and inspect the house. I wanted to understand what had drawn him away and maybe rediscover some fragments of my childhood, the time when smiles greeted me, not sighs. The journey there was long. The roads weren't great. It's a tiny town, no more than 250 people, most of whom grow wheat. Not much happens there. Besides the farms, there's only a small church and a single store. Everything else is either too far or too forgotten. Driving past the sprawling fields, I fell into such a daze that I nearly missed the exit. The place is so tucked away that if you miss that one turn, it's gone. There are no markers, only the distant view of the church hints at where to turn. I veered left and hoped my car's suspension could take the last stretch. I figured I'd visit the church. We used to go there often. Plenty of space to park. It looked smaller than I remembered, but maybe that's just the way memory works. Everything used to feel enormous. Returning after so long stirs something strange. As I stepped out, the past rushed back. The scents, the breeze. Even if you can't name it, there's something that stirs in the mind, whispering, "This is where you once belonged." "Welcome," a voice called. "Apologies for, well, the state of the place." I turned to find a man, a few years older than me, standing nearby. His hair was neatly combed, thick glasses perched on his nose, and he wore the robes of a priest. I had nearly forgotten. The old village priest had already been ancient when I was young. No wonder there was someone new now. "I'm Father Cherniak," he said. "Are you visiting or new around here?" "I grew up here," I replied. "One of the Dabrowski kids." He gave a polite smile. "Sorry, I don't recognize the name. I only returned last winter to take over duties from Father Golich." "He lived until then?" I asked, surprised. "You're certain?" "Absolutely," he chuckled. "Reached 101 years. "No way," I grinned. "That's wild. The Lord sure has a playful side." Father Cherniak gave me a tour. He talked about his ideas for fixing up the stained glass. But what really bothered him most were the doors, or rather, the lack of them. The church stood completely open. "It's an old superstition," he muttered. "A shepherd needs no gate to tend his flock, yet every time I hang the doors, someone takes them off." "That's odd," I said. "I've never heard anything like that." "Really? I thought you were local," he replied. "Must have been gone too long, Father." The church seemed exposed, bare, no separation. I noticed the dirty gravel tracked inside. Clearly no one had wiped their shoes. Father Cherniak had tried hanging curtains, but windstorms had ripped them down, one thread at a time. Before I left, he led me to my father's grave. It had been desecrated. The marker lay crooked, no flowers in sight. I swore I'd tidy it up before I left, but I was confused. Sure, our family had flaws, but we were never disliked. That grave felt like someone hated him. I thanked Father Cherniak and headed further into town. What I saw left me stunned. Across the town, homes stood wide open, much like the church. At first I thought maybe it was some seasonal cleanup, but that wasn't it. Every single house had no doors, not just left ajar, completely taken down. I could see directly into their living spaces. People moved about inside, chatting as they passed from kitchens to bedrooms. I slowed down to get a better look. Not one room had a proper door, not even the washrooms. Some had hung curtains or mosquito nets, but no real doors. One after another, house after house, utterly exposed to the weather. A few had doormats placed beneath windows, like that's where visitors should enter. Some had bricked up the old entrances completely, closing them off for good. Sure, small towns can get a bit eccentric, but I'd never seen anything this bizarre. Then I pulled into a driveway I knew all too well, and I froze. I could barely recognize my own childhood home. It had been destroyed, every window smashed, every door ripped away. Rats darted through the debris. Circling the property, it only got worse. A fire had scorched the backyard, blackening the kitchen wall. It hadn't collapsed, but with a good punch, you could probably break through. And scrawled across the far wall in glaring neon green paint were the words, Sin Diabla, Son of the Devil. I stood frozen. Even our swing set had been torn apart, leaving behind a corroded frame of twisted iron. Looked like someone had attempted to ignite a pile of tires but never got the flames going. I strained to recall how it all used to be, but the image wouldn't come. A deep, hollow feeling started to churn in my gut, where every cherished memory now mocked me. Something had definitely occurred, something I'd never been told about. As I rounded the corner, I noticed a cluster of men, middle-aged, standing just beyond the edge of the property, eyeing my car. I didn't know a single face. "You from the bank?" one of them asked. "No," I answered. "I'm the Dabrowski kid." "The son? You're the son?" he said with a sneer. "Looking to join him down there in the fire? That it?" "You know who trashed this place?" I snapped, pointing at the wreck. "Could have been anyone," a voice replied from the back. One of them gave a crooked smirk and nodded toward the spray paint. They murmured to each other, laughing just loud enough for me to hear. They glared, mumbled more curses, and walked off with mocking grins. Definitely not the homecoming I was expecting. My plan had been to stay the night in the house, but that clearly wasn't happening. It wasn't just open to the wind. It was completely ruined. I won't go into graphic detail about what was done inside, but honestly, I'd be lucky to give the place away now. So I opted to sleep in my car. I reclined the seat, wrapped a blanket around me, and prayed it wouldn't get too chilly. I scrolled through my phone a bit, careful not to drain the battery. Yet even then, I couldn't bring myself to sleep until way after midnight. Still, something about that evening held a strange beauty. The sunset painted the sky just like it always had. That part hadn't changed at all. Seeing the sun dip behind those familiar fields reminded me that not everything moves on. I must have drifted off, but I remember waking around 2 a.m. for no real reason. It wasn't the cold, no sounds disturbed me, and my phone was silent. A gentle breeze brushed the hood of the car. I stayed still, eyes half open, trying not to focus on the seat sticking to my damp skin. Outside, the soft chorus of nature whispered in the dark as I tried to shut it all out. Some far-off part of me had heard those sounds before. I listened beyond the chirping of birds and the hum of insects drifting through the fields. But past all that, there was something different. A sound carried from afar, a cry, a deep, mournful cry. The next morning, I wandered through the town. Word had gotten around fast. Jeremiah's kid was back. I felt it in the way strangers glanced sideways as they passed me. Only the children didn't seem to care, and even they were scarce. On the edge of town stood this long stretch of brick wall. It wasn't tall, but it was thick. It had doors embedded straight into it, countless doors, one from every house in the area, each one wedged tightly into the brickwork. I didn't see ours among them. The whole thing gave off an unsettling vibe. Maybe 100 doors or more, sealed shut forever. I instinctively tested a few handles. None of them moved. 2 teenagers stood off to one side, eyeing me. I approached, surprised when they held their ground. They looked smug, but at least they weren't aggressive. Before I could say a word, one of them spoke. "My mom can't stand you," he said. "What did you do?" "I used to live here," I answered. "Just came back to pick up a few things." "Why'd you even come back?" he scoffed. "I'm out the second I can scrape enough together." "Same here," said the other, fidgeting with an unlit cigarette. I shot them a weary glance. A man strolled past down the street, glaring daggers at me. A wrong word to the wrong person could get my jaw broken. Leaning closer, I said in a hushed tone, "I'm Dabrowski's son. That's the real reason they can't stand me." The kid almost dropped his cigarette. I managed to buy their interest with a promise, a 6-pack from the next town over. In exchange, they'd walk me through what had gone down over the years. Seemed like a decent deal. I had clearly missed a lot. We made our way toward the eastern side of town. There was an old farm that had stood there forever. No one ever gave it a name. It had always just been there. Now, barely a skeleton remained, only the ghost of what used to be a home. It all began years back. Folks started hearing knocking sounds coming from that old wreck. There was once a door still standing, barely hanging onto the decayed frame outside. "You could hear it at night," one of the boys said. "Tap, tap, like a gateway to hell." "That sounds terrifying," I replied. "Not for everyone," the second kid muttered. "There was one man who didn't mind it. Didn't take a genius to guess who they meant. Word around town was my father had wandered up there one night and opened that door. It snapped off its hinges, and according to the locals, something stepped out. Some believed it was the devil. A few younger ones thought it came from another planet. Most people just called it Sleepik. When the door shattered, it slipped through," the boy continued. "Now it's stuck here." "So it's still around?" I asked. "You're serious?" "Of course," he chuckled. "What else would mess this town up so bad?" "Then what's the deal with all the doors?" "It's trying to get back to wherever it came from," he said. "When it picks the wrong door, it lashes out. Hurts people." Slepic. That was the name they gave it, a hideous word usually for a blind man or a burrowing thing. They called it that due to its awful sight. It confused every door with the one it needed. For years, Slepic had wandered from home to home, rapping on every door it could. And if anyone answered, something awful happened. People had vanished. A few had been found dead. I drove the teenage duo to the neighboring town to get them the beer I'd promised. As we traveled, they told me everything they knew. Felt strange ferrying a couple of punks out of town, but I had a feeling they'd seen worse for less. Troublemakers, sure, but oddly sincere ones. At first, folks just stayed hidden inside. Then Slepic would knock until the outer doors gave way. It would then start banging on the inner ones. Over time, people just got rid of them. Anyone who didn't eventually got a visit. With all those abandoned doors, they built that brick wall, fooling Slepic into pacing there after dark. "This can't be real," I said. "It's insane." "It is real," said the first boy, "and that's why they despise your stupid dad." He let it in. "But why not just move away?" I asked. "I'm planning to," said the first kid. "Told you already." The second one paused, clearly mulling it over, then glanced at his friend with a shrug. He spoke like it was something he'd wrestled with many times. "Every place is nice," he said, "but nothing beats home." Of course he'd say that. No matter what, home is home. I bought them their six-pack along with some greasy takeout. Picked up something for myself, too, while I was at it. The trip wasn't particularly far, just far enough to be annoying. By the time we returned, the sky had begun to dim. They bolted out of the car, tossing me a rushed farewell. As they did, the second one shouted back. "You should check for yourself," he said. "Slepnik only comes out after dark." He gestured down the road towards the brick barrier. I gave them a silent nod in return. I wasn't convinced. I needed proof. From what I'd heard the night before, this thing, if it existed, would be roaming after midnight. So I turned in early. And by turned in, I mean I curled up in my car for a second miserable night. I thought about just driving off at sunrise, but something heavy clung to me, a sorrow I couldn't shake. This was the land I grew up in. I ran through these fields as a kid. It felt off, being back in a place where I no longer belonged. My father had his flaws, but he wasn't some demon's disciple. If he ever opened that door, he must have had a reason. And if he unleashed something that didn't belong here, then surely it wasn't on purpose. He wasn't wicked, just imperfect. Maybe he had no other option. Maybe Slepnik didn't leave him one. I must have drifted off at some point. Forgot to set an alarm, but still woke up around 2:30 a.m. I almost fell back asleep, but reminded myself of my promise to take one final look. So I climbed out, stretched my limbs, and listened. That night, it was easier. There was a sound that pierced through the stillness, that howling, sharper this time. Despite the darkness, I could tell exactly where it was coming from. The homes had killed their lights, letting the moon alone cast its glow on the empty streets. Still, I knew these roads. I could trace them with my eyes closed. I walked along a worn path that curved past two houses on the town's outskirts and straight toward the brick wall. The closer I got, the louder it became. A man's scream, raw, unfiltered grief pouring from his lungs like a child in anguish. Ahead of me stood the wall, those bricked-over doors etched in moonlight like some eerie, flattened mural. And right in the center of it all stood a figure, swallowed in shadow. It resembled a man, at least partially. I couldn't make out his full appearance. He wore a thick coat. He kept tugging at one of the sealed doors, hammering it again and again with a clenched fist. The rhythm never changed. Pull, pound, pound, pull, pound, pound. And between each attempt, he'd snap his head side to side, sobbing like he was lost in despair. I thought about getting closer. This wasn't some monstrous entity. This was a man in agony. I stepped forward just a few paces when something flickered at the edge of my sight. A light. I turned to look and spotted a dim beam from a nearby house. They were recording me on their phones. Peering closer, I noticed two small faces watching me, shaking their heads firmly, signaling no. I turned my gaze back to the wall and suddenly heard a loud snap. The man had yanked one of the sealed doors clean off the bricks. It broke free and he rested it beside him, then shoved it downward with one arm. His grip wasn't even solid, yet with one hand he shattered the door into splinters. The sobs evolved into shrieks, uncontrolled, furious screams. With just his hands, he tore the bricks loose, flinging them through the air like they were paper scraps. I could hear them hitting the ground, scattering in the grass nearby. I started to retreat as the lights in the house went dark. The young faces ducked out of view. I rushed down the trail, watching as Lepnik hauled himself onto the wall, roaring with primal rage. Even from afar, I sensed something wasn't right. His shape looked distorted. I couldn't explain it. He had cloaked himself in some shadowy material, but there was something about him that defied logic. I didn't stick around to analyze it. Call it what you will. Maybe he was just an unhinged man. Regardless, I knew I was staring at something dangerous. When the townspeople decide to hide, it's wise to follow their lead. So, I rushed down the dirt path, the chilling echo of his scream drifting through the fields. Sleep barely came to me that night. Believing in monsters is one thing, encountering them is another. As dawn broke, I drove away. But as I passed the church, something caught my eye. A white van stood outside, and one of the church doors had been replaced. Two men, perched on ladders, were preparing to install the other door, which lay hidden beneath a tarp nearby. Father Cherniak stood at the front, beaming with a broad smile. Curious, I decided to see for myself. Surely, he must know what he was doing. The moment I parked, Father Cherniak gestured for me to come over. He was beside me even before my boots met the gravel. "Welcome back," he grinned. "Glad to see you're still with us." I shut the car door and stretched, letting out a slight yawn. "What's going on here? What's all this?" I asked. "You inspired me," he replied. "You know, I saw it in your face. For an outsider, this place must have seemed terrible." He turned to the church as the carpenters began propping up the second door. "It must be dignified," he continued. "Our Lady deserves better, don't you think?" "This is a mistake," I said. "I've seen that thing lurking around town." Father Cherniak shook his head and placed a hand on my shoulder. A man skilled in conversation, I could tell. "If the Lord's house can't shield you from evil, what can?" he said. In return for a little manual work, he offered me a hot shower and a meal. After spending a couple of nights in my car, I couldn't refuse. Whether smooth talk or not, Father Cherniak seemed genuine. He truly believed in what he said. As time passed, more and more townsfolk arrived, mostly to scold him for being foolish. Some hurled rocks at the door, demanding he remove it. Others, however, thought it was high time someone at the church stood up. As Father Cherniak had said, "If the house of the Lord can't protect you from evil, then what can?" By the afternoon, a crowd had gathered. Even those who were angry earlier in the day began to waver. The argument was simple. Did they not trust in God? There was even a small cookout. Some brought sausages or steaks for the evening meal. I saw the two teenagers in the crowd sneaking a bit of wine from one of the older folks. Time seemed to slip away unnoticed. It felt almost like the harvest festival from years past, a time that pulled the town out of seclusion. The sounds, the smells, they were all the same, and I could tell from the smiles on the faces around me that I wasn't the only one feeling that way. Later, Father Cherniak delivered a sermon. I don't recall much of it as I struggled to stay awake. It was as if I had slipped back into my childhood days. It's amazing how something as uncomfortable as those church pews can lull you to sleep. But there was one part of the sermon that stayed with me. "The door is a threshold," he said. "The door of the church separates the foul from the holy, the sinner from the saint. We can no longer live in doubt. We must live as we are taught, and we proudly say we have been taught well." The sermon continued well into the evening, concluding just as the sun set. Some people headed home, but others felt too ashamed to leave. What had started as a public gathering had transformed into something more, a test of the congregation's faith against the very devil himself. A few went home to gather blankets and pillows, planning to sleep on the floor. This wasn't easy for them. They spoke of people who had disappeared over the years, those who had opened the door when Slepnik first arrived. An old woman had her neck snapped. A man had been dragged into the yard and hanged from a tree. Another had been mutilated. "It tore his arm clean out of the socket," they whispered. "We found it across the street." I tried talking to the villagers, but it was clear that no one wanted to speak with me. I was still known as Jeremiah's boy. The only ones who didn't seem to mind were the two teenagers I had spoken with earlier. Later that evening, they walked over to me, probably to annoy their parents. "Aren't you scared?" one of them asked. "Should I be?" I replied. "It's got a blooded tooth waiting for you," said the other. "I don't think so," I smiled. "I've only seen it once." "Yeah, but..." They grew quiet, exchanging glances before looking back at me. I could tell I was missing something. "Your dad," they said. "Slepnik got him," they continued. "Didn't anyone tell you?" They hadn't. It turned out it was a piece of malfunctioning farm equipment that had killed him years ago. But it was Slepnik. My dad had been the first victim. Most of the villagers had seen him as a sinner who got what he deserved. Some people thought that if you played dangerous games, you would inevitably face dire consequences. They had found him tangled up in the swing set, his body broken and disfigured. The kids left me alone with my troubled thoughts for a while. They could tell I wasn't in my right mind. It was one thing to have lost him, but to die in such a brutal, horrifying way, that was unfathomable. I struggled to picture his face, but now another image kept trying to take its place. Chains rattling, blood dripping. But there wasn't much time to dwell on it. As midnight passed, a knock came at the door. The church grew silent. Something tugged at the handles. 2 sharp knocks, followed by another tug. The doors were huge, and the hinges had just been reinforced, but I could still see them groan under the pressure. Father Cherniak took a deep breath. As the room remained hushed, he spoke in a firm voice. "This is no place for sons of sin," he declared. "There's nothing here for you to corrupt." And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. We all let out a collective sigh of relief, but the 2 teenagers seemed unconvinced. They huddled in the corner of the church. There was an emergency exit through one of the side rooms. The door moved again, this time with more force. The handles were pulled harder, and the thudding made the heavy wooden door creak and groan like a collapsing mine shaft. And then came the wail. the loud, frantic wail. As soon as I heard it, I saw the color drain from everyone's face. The door continued to be yanked back and forth, back and forth. A chandelier overhead began to shake. "It's coming down!" someone shouted. "It's coming down now!" Father Cherniak tried to restore some calm, but it was already too late. The crowd scrambled toward the rear exit, desperate to flee. I was shoved aside in the chaos. If the Dabrowski kid met his end, well, that was one less problem to deal with for some of the others. "There is no sin in the house of the Lord," Father Cherniak cried out. "There is no sin." The devil could laugh and taunt all he wanted, but there was no place for his evil in that sanctuary. But words, no matter how powerful, couldn't stop a broken door. Slepnik wasn't going to give up. The doors finally crashed down, and the moment they hit the ground, the room fell into a brief stillness. The air rushed through the church, blowing out most of the candles along the pews. And as the doors hit the floor, panic spread like wildfire. Most of the crowd had already fled. Shouts of fear filled the air, and curses were muttered in panic. I found myself near the back, realizing there was no way I could escape without being trampled. Instead, I ducked down among the front pews, hoping the shadows would conceal me. In the dim, flickering candlelight, I could barely make out Slepnik's form. His right arm was unnaturally protruding from his shoulder blade, and his left arm stretched so long that it scraped against the floor. He had a twisted, hunched posture, but there was something strange wriggling on his back, fluttering like a nervous membrane. He wasn't wearing a coat. He was beyond human. It was as if he was an eerie imitation of a person. Even Father Cherniak, usually the one to lead, was running now, retreating behind the altar. Slepnik charged through the room, his movements wild and erratic, knocking over pews with ease. Nothing could slow him down. When he reached the side room, those who hadn't already fled were now running outside in terror. But Slepnik was too slow to catch them. Instead, he turned his rage on the room, throwing whatever he could grab, tearing through anything in his path, smashing objects with brute force. His wailing had shifted into fury, and he was a mindless storm of destruction. I lay flat on my stomach, trying to crawl away unnoticed. Father Cherniak wasn't as fortunate. Just as Slepnik had done with the brick wall, he climbed the altar, and from there, his monstrous form caught sight of the priest. I don't want to revisit the horror of what I saw. It would be wrong to make a spectacle of such suffering. But Slepnik didn't care about dignity or respect. He didn't care about anything. With a single arm, he lifted Father Cherniak, holding him out in front as if he were evaluating an unfamiliar object. The priest struggled, desperately crying out. In his final moments, he called on all his power. He commanded, he pleaded, and when those efforts proved useless, he begged, praying to anything that could save him. But Slepnik responded by unhinging his jaw like a snake. The screams were cut short with a sharp snap, followed by a spray of blood that shot outward. A dull thud echoed as something hit the altar and rolled across the floor. I saw glasses clatter across the wood. Slepnik spat and gagged, pulling bits of hair from between his teeth. He released the body, letting it slump onto the crimson carpet without care. I remember crawling. I moved as quietly as I could, carefully inching forward. Slepnik was massive, but his footsteps were eerily light, like he was tiptoeing around the room. I hadn't noticed he was right behind me until his shadow overtook me. I turned to find his immense form looming above me. He must have seen me. The candles were still burning, their faint glow casting long, trembling shadows. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of his face. It was a half-formed ashen mass with black, hollow eyes that curved inward like a deepening pit. A faint glimmer, reminiscent of fish scales, covered his skin. His mouth was human, but with an extra unnaturally sharp mandible. His nose twitched, adjusting to the scent of burning wax and blood. Blood still dripped from his distorted lips. Then he reached for me, slow and deliberate. I closed my eyes as he pulled me closer. His gaze stayed locked on mine. He was so close now I could feel the heat radiating from his mouth. Maybe he thought I'd taste better? Suddenly, he made a sound. I can't quite describe it. Something I had never heard before. Perhaps it was a squeal or some kind of bewildered rattle. He let go of me, lowering me back down gently. I opened my eyes and saw his immense black eyes shift away from me. He was leaving. His fury seemed to fade, but his long arms scraped across the floor as his wail rose again. But this time, it wasn't frantic. It was muddled, confused. The effects of the incident were swift. Some people immediately began gathering their weapons. Others blamed the priest, accusing him of not being holy enough. A few decided to leave the town altogether. After all, if God couldn't protect them, they had no choice but to protect themselves. I headed back to my father's house. There were so many things I wished he had told me, but it was far too late for questions now. I had no idea what kind of trouble he had gotten into, but I couldn't just stand by and hope it would all settle down. If this was his doing, if all of this was his fault, I would join the others in cursing his name. But I couldn't do that without knowing the truth. I had to be certain. I started tearing through the house, room by room, rifling through drawers, overturning boxes. I threw old clothes aside. I overturned the bed, ripped down the wardrobe, crashing it to the floor in a desperate attempt to find anything that could explain what was happening. Finally, I stormed into the backyard. I saw the stains on the swing set. I remembered my father pushing me on it, the chains creaking as I soared higher and higher. But now that same sound felt different. It had become something darker. The image of a broken man tangled in an abandoned toy flashed in my mind. I couldn't say how long I lost control inside that house, but eventually I hit it hard. As I mentioned, part of the kitchen had been burned. I could punch through it, so I did. To my surprise, there was a hidden panel beneath the kitchen sink. At first, I didn't register it. I thought I had simply struck another solid wall. As I regained my composure and examined it more closely, I realized that it was a small compartment beneath the sink. My punch had gone straight through from the outside. I sat down on the wet grass, feeling the moisture soak into my jeans as I sifted through the contents. Inside, there was a box. It had been ravaged by rats, parts of it scorched, but there were small remnants I could recognize. Family albums, mostly filled with photos of me and my sisters, friends from the village. One image stood out, a picture of Dad next to his first car. There were also printed and framed Facebook photos, the kind of things people keep as keepsakes. But then the photos stopped. No more birthdays, no more dates. The pages became blank, but I kept flipping through. In the back of the album, I discovered something else. More pictures, more notes, photographs of a door with a message on the back. It's not screaming, it's crying. Scrawled in the margins were little notes expressing fear, confusion, and loneliness. It spoke of no one listening, no one caring. The photos stopped and only notes remained. My father had to get out, but he also wanted to stay. It spoke of him hunting elk in the forest and bringing it to me. There was nothing left of him, I understood. It told a story of my father trying to help something that didn't belong, something from another world. They shared meals in goodwill, attempting to connect. This had evidently gone on for months. The writing mentioned the changing seasons, spring turning to winter. I will let him sleep in the house, the last note read. Maybe it will help with his night terrors. Something must have gone wrong. A dangerous creature like that inside a small house? Maybe an accident had happened, a misunderstanding. Perhaps it had strung him up with chains, forcing him to look alive like a puppet. Either way, I was close to finding the truth. I realized that maybe I was more like my father than I had ever known. As I reflected on it, I felt like I was moving in a trance. My thoughts weren't clear. Maybe it was the rush of adrenaline. I wandered through town in a daze, heading back toward the outskirts. It was quieter now. Many had hurried off in their cars. I followed the dirt road back to the brick wall, and there he was, Slutnik, wailing weakly, tapping on the bricked-up door. He tugged gently at the handle, as if hoping against hope for something to change. He wasn't angry when I came closer. He was bewildered. I had to make him comprehend, to see the truth of everything. So, despite everything I had witnessed and all the sounds I had heard, I chose to follow my intuition. My father had made many errors, but he wasn't foolish. His missteps were genuine. So, if this was indeed a mistake, I prayed it would be a sincere one. "Follow me," I instructed. "This way." Slutnik moved silently, his steps light as feathers. Though the town still buzzed with noise, it was all drowned by his soft wails. Slutnik couldn't help it. We headed toward the cemetery, toward the toppled headstone in the neglected patch of land. I tapped the earth, glanced at the creature, and said the simplest words I could manage. "Here," I told him. "Father." Maybe it understood, maybe it didn't, but it was able to tear up the ground with ease, as if it were nothing. It took a while, but not as long as it should have. My father hadn't been buried deeply or properly. Just as no one had cared for his funeral, no one had cared for his burial place either. It didn't take long for Slutnik to get down to the casket, and when his hands met the box, I looked down and saw something unexpected. You see, my father had passed away poor, so poor that they hadn't bothered with a proper casket. It was more of a crude box, and the lid seemed familiar. Upon closer inspection, I realized it was the front door of our house. They had just used it as a makeshift lid and left it at that. Slutnik ran his long fingers over the door, his wail softening into a hum. He had found the door he'd been searching for. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. A monstrous creature prying open a casket, brushing away dry blue sunflowers, lifting an abandoned body from its grave, and cradling it like a mother soothing a child, its wail now reduced to a quiet sob. "Ta-ta," it murmured, "ta-ta." Slutnik wandered off into the darkness, past men with weapons and those hiding behind closed doors. He didn't care. Maybe he never had. Maybe he had only been angry because he couldn't find the right door. But as the chaos quieted, there was no longer a need to guard your doors. Slutnik had gone. I sold my father's property, but I kept the photo albums. His name is still uttered with a curse, but at least that curse no longer lingers. As far as I know, there have been no further sightings of Slutnik. The locals weren't eager to label the devil when they contacted the authorities. A few attempted to do so, but it's far easier to convince people of a murderer than a creature of nightmare. Questions circulated throughout the countryside, but like most mysteries, it was abandoned in an untouched folder, forgotten and ignored. I went back to Orzawa. It may not be where I belong, but I've come to realize that home is not just a physical place, it's a moment in time, and that time has passed. It's taken a lot to come to terms with that. I may not have a true home right now, but that doesn't mean I'll never have one. Like Slutnik, I believe there's a constant search for somewhere to belong. But above the southern hills, the woods remain silent. There are no mournful cries, no knocking, no screams. And I believe that somewhere beyond those trees, anyone can discover a place to call home.